Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister is one of the most powerful people in the country, and that's a function of the Prime Minister's office, which includes a number of serious powers. And foremost among those is the power to decide at any time that Parliament is done, that the work of Parliament is finished, and that we're going to have an election, or that Parliament's work can just be put on pause, and the important work that's happening at committee can be not just put on pause, but actually stopped and have to start up again in another session of Parliament. And we've seen this power used appropriately over the course of Canadian history. We've also seen it be abused. One of the most recent examples of the abuse of this power was in the summer of 2020, when the government embroiled in the We Charity scandal, with many committees studying what had happened, calling for witnesses, calling for papers and evidence about what was going on in the government and how this scandal arose. The Prime Minister decided to say, we're proroguing Parliament. And all that work stopped. And members of Parliament weren't able to come to this place or to work together in order to do the work that we're elected to do, which is to hold the government to account. So we saw that happen in the summer of 2020. It was a controversial decision to prorogue. I think many Canadians were rightly upset about that. I was part of an effort at the Procedure and House Affairs Committee to get to the bottom of why it was that the Prime Minister chose to prorogue. One of the real frustrations in that sitting was that the Prime Minister himself refused to come to that study. And in fact, we watched Liberal members on that committee filibuster for months on end in order to avoid a simple invitation to the Prime Minister to come and explain his own actions. So that was certainly an example where we saw the power of prorogation abused. I would say arguably just the next year in 2021, we saw this same Prime Minister abuse a similar power, which was to dissolve Parliament and to declare our work finished and to go to the polls. We have fixed election date laws in Canada. Unfortunately, there's no way to punish Prime Ministers for ignoring those laws, as the Prime Minister did in the fall of 2021 when he called an election while we were still in the midst of a pandemic. In fact, the Procedure and House Affairs Committee was in the process of looking at a government bill designed to make accommodations for the pandemic at election time. And instead of respecting the work of that committee, and instead of respecting all the many voices across the country who said Canada wasn't ready to have an election during a pandemic, the Prime Minister pulled the plug and held the election anyway. It was an election no one but him wanted. And that was very clear and made very clear to all of us on the doorstep in the course of that election. But nevertheless, it was the Prime Minister, through the power of his office, who was able to do that without any meaningful accountability. I want to go back to an example much earlier, but nevertheless in this century. Folks will be relieved to hear. I'm not going back all the way to the 19th century or something. Just in 2008, we had a Prime Minister, Prime Minister Harper, who I think actually affected the most egregious abuse of the power of prorogation. When he knew that opposition parties were going to bring a non-confidence motion forward to say that the members of this place did not believe that he should govern, instead of facing the House and facing that vote, which would have been the honorable thing to do, he instead chose to abuse the powers of the Prime Minister's office and prorogue Parliament so that opposition members could not bring a motion of confidence or non-confidence to the House. It was indeed a shameful thing. And it's something that up to now there's been a lot of discussion about, but I don't think that there have been real proposals to try and do something about. Now, it's difficult to do something about it because in our Constitution, dissolving or proroguing Parliament is said to be a power of the monarch, of the Queen, or now the King. But really it's a power of the Prime Minister, because it's only on the Prime Minister's advice that this is done. But just because it's a power that's granted to the monarchy, we need a constitutional amendment in order to do anything about it, or so we've been told. But I think it's really important. If you consider all the important institutions that make up the very foundation of Canadian government, you think about the monarch, you think about the executive or the government, you think about the House of Commons, you think about the judiciary, you think about the Senate. Actually, only one of those is directly elected by Canadians, and that's the House of Commons. The monarch certainly isn't elected. We've all been bearing witness to that process recently. The Senate isn't elected.
No, not at all.
Right? Judges aren't elected. I don't think that's a bad thing. We need accountability in the process of their appointment. They're not elected. The executive isn't directly elected. It's actually the House of Commons that ultimately decides who sits in the Prime Minister's chair or not, based on what happens at election time. And I think that the House of Commons, both as the democratically elected component of Canadian government, but also as the institution whose job it is to hold the government to account, should be the one to decide whether the work here is paused in a prorogation. The House of Commons here, as the democratically elected chamber, should be one to decide if we're done before fixed election date laws say we would be done, and to have an early election. And so what this motion does is, within the context, the constitutional context that we're in, because no simple motion in the House of Commons can change the Constitution, that's as it should be. What this does is allows us, the members of this place, to assert our rightful role in having a much bigger say on when our work begins and when it ends, and whether it's stopped or paused by a Prime Minister. That is a decision that should be in the hands of Canadians. And you want to talk about gatekeeping in Canada, one of the biggest gatekeeping powers that exists in the power of the Prime Minister to get out of accountability to Parliament. And anyone who is concerned about fighting inappropriate gatekeeping in Canada should be concerned to constrain that power by the Prime Minister. That's what this motion is really about, Mr. Speaker. It's about making it more difficult for Prime Ministers to prorogue Parliament to get out of facing accountability on a confidence vote. It's about making it more difficult for Prime Ministers to get out of accountability for scandals like the We Charity scandal or the question of Afghan detainees by telling members of this Parliament to go back to their riding and not come back until the Prime Minister decides he's okay with having them back. It's about ensuring that the Prime Minister doesn't get to inappropriately influence votes in this place by suddenly declaring something that has nothing to do with confidence and everything to do with covering his own behind or a special pet project in order to try and force members to vote for something they wouldn't otherwise vote for. That's what this motion is about. And that's why it's so important that this motion pass, because it's about time that the House of Commons started pushing back on those other unelected parts of the Canadian governance structure and assert its own authority and its own decision-making power, especially in regard to our ability to sit in this place and to hold governments to account. So how does it constrain the power of the Prime Minister? Well, as I say, there's no perfect solution without a constitutional amendment. But what it would mean is that a Prime Minister who wanted to prorogue would have the option of first having a confidence vote in the House of Commons before a prorogation. And if the Prime Minister doesn't do that, it guarantees that the first order of business when parliamentarians come back won't be the Prime Minister's speech from the throne, where he or she gets to frame the issues however they like. It'll be a debate and a vote of confidence in the government after it made a decision to prorogue. And I say that would have been especially important in the case of the Harper prorogation, because he prorogued in order to avoid a confidence vote. And then we know that the next way for opposition parties at that time to have a confidence vote would have been on an opposition day motion. Well, who decides when you have opposition day motions? The government decides when you have an opposition day motion. So that doesn't really work as an accountability mechanism. If the Prime Minister can prorogue for as long as he wants and then delay an opposition day motion for just about as long as he likes after you come back, then opposition parties don't have the ability to hold the government to account in the appropriate way. What this guarantees is that there will be a moment of accountability at the beginning of every parliament with a confidence vote. There will be the possibility of the Prime Minister doing the right thing and testing the confidence of the chamber before prorogation. And if he doesn't, it guarantees that the first order of business when we come back will be a confidence vote to have that accountability for the House of Commons. And it makes it clear for members how they can go about initiating a confidence vote. And it lays out a process for that. The details are in the motion. I'll spare folks the details of all of that. The other thing that it does, though, that I think is also quite important, is that it says specifically what votes will be votes of confidence. So, traditionally, by convention, the speech from a throne is a vote of confidence. This motion would simply write that down in the standing orders so that it's no longer a question where you have to call in a whole bunch of constitutional experts that have studied the history of Canada since, 1867 in order to weigh in. We'll know because it's written in the standing orders that that's a vote of confidence. We'll know that the budget vote is a vote of confidence because it'll be written down in the standing orders. We'll know that the main vote on estimates is a confidence motion. Well, why does that matter? Well, there's been many times where we've had all-night voting on the estimates, every line item, and it's always a debate, and you hear it in the media. Well, could the government fall on any vote? Some people say, yes, it could. Others say, well, no, they can't. Others say, well, it's complicated. And maybe they would, and maybe they wouldn't, and maybe they'd lose that vote, and then the next day the government would have to come to the House and then have a more explicitly worded motion of confidence, or maybe the Prime Minister will just decide. We're a 21st century democracy. How is it so unclear how it is that the only elected chamber, the only elected part of our Constitution would sit or not sit, or have confidence or not have confidence, or have an election or not have an election? These are things that we should be able to put our heads together to sort out and be crystal clear to Canadians so that they don't have to do a PhD in Canadian constitutional history to understand what the heck is going on in this place. It's something we should be able to teach in a grade 12 civics class and be proud of. And the idea behind this motion is to make it a heck of a lot more clear so that we can do exactly that. Because to have a lack of clarity around these issues that are so central to the well-functioning of our democracy is to invite the kind of toxic debates and the kind of intractable disputes that we see too often now in Western democracies about whether this was a power grab or whether the government acted appropriately or not. The way to defend about this is to seek the maximum amount of clarity before you're in a crisis. Already this year, there was speculation in the media about whether a motion in the House would be a confidence vote or not a confidence vote. The government House leader refused to comment. So it hung in the air. Well, it shouldn't be that way. We should know clearly whether something is a vote of confidence or not a vote of confidence. There's been rumors around prorogation already in this Parliament. Well, we should know that if a Prime Minister is going to prorogue and we think that it's a bad decision, that the House of Commons itself will have the opportunity to pronounce on whether the government was making an acceptable decision or not. That's something that this House ought to be able to do. Why? Because we're the only ones that are elected with a mandate to make those kinds of decisions. It's not the Prime Minister, and it's not anybody else. It's certainly not the King or Queen that has the ability to make that decision. It's not a decision for the Senate, where they've all been appointed by previous Prime Ministers to make that decision. This is the place that that decision ought to be made. That's the way you put democracy before gatekeeping. That's what this motion is about, and it's why I encourage all members of this House to give their support to this motion. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Finance.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech and for putting this together. He's obviously thought it through. I appreciated how he went through how some ways the current rules could be abused. But he's a thoughtful guy, and so I'm sure he's thought about the other side. Has he considered any ways that this change in procedure could potentially be abused? And if so, has he thought about ways to mitigate it, or is there no ways that this can be abused?
The Honourable Member for Elmwood Transcona.
I think Canadians would agree that politicians are often disappointing in finding ways to abuse things that ought not to be abused. So I certainly wouldn't make the claim that any particular thing that comes out of this place is beyond abuse. One hopes that it has enough clarity and instruction behind it that folks will find it hard to abuse. I think one of the ways that I was concerned this might be abused, having a new way of presenting a confidence motion, was that it could be used as a dilatory tactic. So one of the provisions in this motion is that in order to move a motion of non-confidence or confidence, as the case may be, there are two ways to present those motions. you need a mover, and then you need 20 other members to sign on to it. And they have to be from at least 2 recognized political parties. And so that is one of the ways that I've sought to try and ensure that this new type of motion won't be something that's used continuously as a dilatory tactic. And I could say more about that. I think if you read the motion in its entirety, you'll find there are some other guardrails in there as well, exactly because, and in fact, in what the Speaker read in the guiding principles, it's exactly that this shouldn't be seen as a dilatory tactic or some other way to conduct funny business. What we want is for votes of confidence, for folks to have, for members of Parliament to have lots of notice that they're coming. Then we want a full day of debate, and we want to vote at the end of that day so that it's a clear process that hopefully is not open to abuse.
In comments, question commentaire, the honourable member for St. Albert Edmonton.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Elmwood Transcona. I know that he certainly brings a lot of knowledge on questions of procedure. My issue with the motion is largely one of the process that the member has chosen. Many aspects of his motion are seemingly novel in terms of what he is proposing, and I am curious as to why he chose this route of 2 hours of debate rather than inserting into the clause a clause into the motion to refer this to the Procedure and House Affairs Committee for a more thorough study.
Member for Elmwood Transcona.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I mean, the issue of confidence has been studied a number of times. It's been studied in the House and outside the House. The reason why I chose not to refer it onto the Procedure and House Affairs Committee is twofold. One is out of respect that they're currently, the work that they're doing currently on foreign interference and a number of important issues, and an issue of privilege, actually, after last day, with respect to the member of Halton, Wellington Hills. But the other reason is because this is something I think it's high time we just got done. And so I do think that there is enough time to examine the content of the motion. I think this would be an improvement, a significant improvement on the current state of affairs, and because I want to make change. And you can't make change without doing something novel. So I don't hide from the fact that there are novel ideas in here. I think they're good ideas, and I welcome the debate that is to come. But I hope that members here will fall on the side of asserting the power of the House of Commons over these decisions and making a change on something that has been open to abuse now since Confederation, and that it's high time we did something about.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire, l'honorable député de Joliette.
The honourable member for Joliette. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to start by congratulating my colleague on his important motion and the very convincing speech that he just gave. Accountability is very important. We need to limit the concentration of powers. And this motion contributes to that because we know that when too much power is concentrated, it almost systematically leads to abuses. My question for my colleague is the following. It's about this government's attitude about what's being voted on. When this House votes on motions or bills, what we see from this Prime Minister is that he does not always respect the will of the House. For example, my colleague presented a motion on tax havens, and it was supported by this House. But then the government did not implement the measures that the motion asked the government to implement. I also have a colleague who presented legislation for people to get more EI for 50 weeks when they're facing cancer, and the government paid no attention to that, despite the fact that it was the will of the House. A Conservative colleague brought forward a bill on family transfers by businesses, and the government did nothing. What does my colleague think of that?
Transcona.
Merci beaucoup.
I'd like to thank my colleague for the question. And indeed, far too often, the government does not take the work that happens in this House of Commons seriously enough, or what is done at committee. And that's why it's so important that we, as members of Parliament, it's so important that we take measures to ensure that that respect is granted to us. And I think by targeting these major powers of the Prime Minister, by saying that it is the House of Commons that should have more influence on those decisions, I think that is how we can ensure that the government takes this much more seriously.